The molten sky churned with ash and ember as Amara approached the gates of the Firelord's fortress. Her pulse quickened, not from fear, though any rational person would fear the man she was about to meet, but from the weight of her mission. The fate of her kingdom hinged on these negotiations, and failure was not an option. The ground beneath her feet was hot, each step a reminder of the power Kale wielded over this volcanic realm. Two towering guards, their bodies marked with swirling, ember-like tattoos, swung open the iron gates. Amara stepped inside, her breath catching as she took in the grandeur of the volcanic palace. Rivers of molten rock flowed through channels in the floor, casting a hellish glow on the obsidian walls. At the far end of the hall, seated on a throne of black stone, was the Fire Lord himself. Kale rose as she approached, and Amara's first impression was one of sheer magnitude. He stood at least a foot taller than any man she'd ever known, his broad shoulders and powerful frame exuding dominance. His skin was a deep, bronzed hue, veins of molten gold glowing faintly beneath the surface. His long, dark hair framed sharp features, but it was his eyes that truly unnerved her, glowing like twin embers. They seemed to peer straight into her soul. Amara of the human kingdom, Kale rumbled, his voice deep and resonant, filling the cavernous hall. You've come to speak of peace. Amara squared her shoulders, forcing herself to meet his gaze. I've come to ensure the survival of both our peoples. War will destroy us all. Kale stepped down from his throne, the heat emanating from him intensifying as he closed the distance between them. When he stopped mere feet away, Amara could feel the oppressive warmth radiating from his body, as though standing too close to an open flame. You speak of survival, Kale said, his tone edged with skepticism. Yet your people send soldiers to my borders. Is that how you define peace? Amara held her ground. My kingdom fears what it does not understand. That's why I'm here, to bridge that gap. Kale studied her for a long moment, the silence stretching between them like a taut wire. Then, without a word, he turned and gestured for her to follow. Amara hesitated only briefly before falling into step behind him. He led her through winding corridors, each more awe-inspiring than the last. They passed chambers where magma flowed freely, illuminating ancient carvings etched into the stone walls. The air grew heavier with heat, and Amara's skin prickled beneath her diplomatic robes. She could feel Kale's eyes on her, even when he wasn't looking directly at her, an unspoken tension simmering between them. Finally, they emerged into a wide, open chamber. At its center was a vast pool of lava, its surface roiling and bubbling with molten intensity. The heat was nearly unbearable, yet Amara found herself drawn to its raw, untamed power. Kale stood at the edge, his gaze fixed on the molten pool. This is the heart of my empire, he said, his voice low. As long as it remains stable, so does my realm. But the volcano grows restless. Amara stepped closer, her pulse quickening as she felt the intense heat of the lava on her skin. And you, she asked softly, do you control it, or does it control you? Kale's eyes flicked to her, a flicker of something unreadable passing across his face. We are bound, he said. Its fury is my strength, but it is also my burden. If I lose control, the volcano will consume everything. The weight of his words settled heavily on Amara's shoulders. This was no ordinary negotiation. Kale's power and his restraint were the only things keeping his empire from annihilation. She realized then that earning his trust would be more difficult than she'd anticipated. Before she could respond, the ground beneath them trembled, a low rumble echoing through the chamber. The molten pool surged, a plume of fire and smoke erupting from its surface. Instinctively, Amara staggered backward, but her footing slipped on the slick obsidian. She gasped as she felt herself falling. Strong hands caught her, pulling her back from the edge. Amara found herself pressed against Kale's chest, his arms wrapped firmly around her. His heat was overwhelming, but there was a strange comfort in his hold, a sense of safety amidst the chaos. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. Amara's heart raced, not from fear, but from the intensity of his gaze. His molten eyes burned with something she couldn't quite name, something that sent a shiver down her spine despite the heat. Careful, diplomat, Kale murmured, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate through her. You tread on dangerous ground. Amara's breath hitched, but she quickly regained her composure, pulling back from his grasp. I'm not afraid of danger, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Kale's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. We'll see. The tremor subsided, and Kale released her, though the space between them now felt charged, as if the very air had thickened. Amara turned her attention back to the lava pool, determined to regain control of the situation. Your people fear the volcano's power, she said, but perhaps if they understood you, they wouldn't see you as an enemy. Kale arched a brow, his expression skeptical. You believe understanding will quell centuries of fear and mistrust. I believe it's a start, Amara replied. And if we don't try, we're doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. Kale regarded her in silence, his molten eyes searching hers. Then he nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. Very well, Amara. You've earned a chance to prove your words. But know this, if you betray me, there will be no mercy. Amara met his gaze, unflinching. I wouldn't expect anything less. Kale's lips twitched, and for a moment, she thought she saw the faintest hint of admiration in his eyes. Then he turned, his cloak of dark, fire-resistant fabric billowing behind him as he strode toward the exit. Come, he said without looking back. We've only just begun. Amara followed Kale through the labyrinthine corridors of the volcanic palace, her mind racing. The Firelord was every bit as imposing as the story suggested, but there was more to him than the monstrous warlord her people feared. She could see the weight of his responsibilities in the tense set of his shoulders, the way his molten eyes flickered with unspoken burdens. He wasn't just a ruler, he was the linchpin holding his entire realm together. The air grew even warmer as they entered a council chamber. The room was circular, with a massive obsidian table at its center. Seated around it were Kale's advisors, each one a demi-human like him, their features a mix of human and beast. They fell silent as Kale and Amara approached, their eyes narrowing with suspicion. This is Amara, Kale announced, his voice commanding. She comes as an envoy from a human kingdom. One of the advisors, a sharp-featured man with scales glinting along his jawline, leaned forward. And why should we trust her, my lord? Humans have brought nothing but war and destruction to our lands. Amara stepped forward, her gaze steady. I'm not here to make empty promises, she said. I'm here to find a way for both our peoples to survive. The volcano's instability threatens us all. The room buzzed with murmurs of dissent. Another advisor, a broad-shouldered woman with molten veins similar to Kale's, spoke up. And what would you know of our plight, human? You've only just arrived. Kale raised a hand, silencing the room. Enough. Amara is under my protection. You will hear her out. The tension in the room was palpable, but the advisors reluctantly nodded. Kale gestured for Amara to take a seat beside him, and she did, feeling the weight of a dozen suspicious eyes on her. Over the next hour, they discussed the tenuous state of the volcanic wards that kept Kale's realm from descending into chaos. Amara offered insights from her kingdom's own ancient texts, suggesting potential ways to reinforce the wards. Though the advisors remained skeptical, Kale listened intently, his molten gaze never leaving her. After the meeting, Kale escorted Amara to a private balcony overlooking the volcanic plains. The view was both awe-inspiring and terrifying, with rivers of molten rock snaking through the dark landscape, their glow lighting up the ash-filled sky. You handled yourself well, Kale said, his voice softer than before. Amara leaned against the railing, the heat from the lava far below warming her skin. They don't trust me. They won't, Kale said. Not until you prove yourself. And you? She asked, turning to face him. Do you trust me? Kale's eyes flickered, the molten glow within them intensifying. He stepped closer, his heat enveloping her. Trust is not given lightly in my realm, Amara. But you've shown courage. That is a start. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared responsibilities hanging between them. Then Kale reached out, his hand brushing against hers. His touch was warm, almost searing, but Amara didn't pull away. Instead, she let herself feel the raw power beneath his skin, the controlled intensity that kept his realm in balance. "You're not what I expected," Kale murmured, his voice low. "Neither are you," Amara replied, her heartbeat quickening. Kale's hand lingered for a moment longer before he pulled back, his expression unreadable. "There's something I want to show you," he said. He led her down another series of corridors, eventually stopping at a heavy stone door etched with ancient runes. Kale pressed his hand against the door, and it rumbled open, revealing a chamber bathed in a soft, golden light. Amara's breath caught as she stepped inside. The walls were covered in intricate carvings, depicting the history of Kale's people and their bond with the volcano. At the center of the room was a large, shallow pool of molten lava, its surface strangely calm. "This is the Chamber of the Ancients," Kale said. "It's where our leaders come to reflect and seek guidance." Amara approached the pool, the heat from the lava radiating up around her. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Kale joined her, his towering presence a comforting weight at her side. "This place is sacred to my people. Few are allowed to enter." Amara turned to him, her eyes searching his. "Why bring me here?" Kale's gaze held hers, the intensity of his molten eyes sending a shiver down her spine. "Because I need you to understand what's at stake. And because, despite everything, I find myself drawn to you." Amara's heart skipped a beat. The air between them felt charged, as if the very heat of the lava had seeped into their connection. She stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "Kale." Before she could finish, a sharp sound echoed through the chamber. A distant crash, followed by the unmistakable rumble of another tremor. The ground beneath them shook, and Kale's expression hardened. "An attack," he said, his voice filled with urgency. "Stay close to me." He led her out of the chamber, the tremors growing stronger with each step. As they reached the main hall, a group of guards rushed past, shouting orders. Kale barked commands, his presence immediately restoring a sense of order. Amara watched as he took control of the situation, his authority and power undeniable. Yet beneath his commanding exterior, she could see the strain, the weight of protecting his people while grappling with the volcanic forces threatening to tear his realm apart. Kale turned to her, his molten eyes blazing. "This isn't just a political struggle, Amara. It's a fight for survival. If we fail, we won't," Amara said firmly, placing a hand on his arm. "We'll find a way. Together." Kale's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, the tension between them melted away. But the urgency of the situation loomed, and Kale nodded, his expression resolute. "Then we must act quickly," he said. "There's no time to waste." The tremors subsided by the time Kale and Amara reached the fortress's war room, but the tension in the air remained thick. The traitor had struck again, and this time, it was clear their actions were designed to undermine both Kale's authority and the fragile peace negotiations. Kale stood at the head of the obsidian table, his molten eyes scanning the reports brought in by his advisors. "The Western Ward has been destabilized," one of the advisors said, his voice grim. "If it fails completely, the entire volcanic ridge will erupt." Kale's jaw tightened. "Have the engineers begun repairs?" "They've been dispatched, but they report signs of sabotage. Whoever is behind this knows our systems well." Amara stepped forward, her mind racing. "If the saboteur is this knowledgeable, they might try to target the other wards. Can we anticipate their next move?" Kale's gaze flicked to her, a glimmer of respect in his fiery eyes. "We can, but it won't be enough to stop them. Not unless we confront them directly." Amara hesitated, then spoke. "I'll go with you. I've studied the ancient texts. If there's anything I can do to help stabilize the wards, I'll do it." A murmur of dissent rippled through the room. The advisors exchanged uneasy glances, but Kale silenced them with a raised hand. "She's proven her worth," he said firmly. "If Amara believes she can help, she will." The room fell silent, and Kale turned back to her. Prepare yourself. We leave at once. The journey to the Western Ward was swift but tense. Kale led the way, his towering form a constant presence beside Amara as they navigated the treacherous terrain. The heat from the molten rivers seemed to intensify as they drew closer to the ward, and Amara's skin prickled beneath her robes. As they reached the base of the ward, a massive structure carved from black stone and lined with glowing runes, Kale paused. His molten eyes scanned the area, his body tense. The traitor could be nearby. Stay close. Amara nodded, her heart pounding. Together, they ascended the narrow path leading to the ward's control chamber. The air grew hotter, the volcanic energy pulsing around them like a living force. Inside the chamber, the damage was immediately apparent. Several of the runes had been shattered, their molten glow dimmed. Kale moved quickly, his powerful hands examining the broken pieces. It's worse than I thought, he muttered. If we don't act now, the ward will collapse. Amara stepped forward, her eyes scanning the ancient inscriptions. These runes can be restored, but it will require a precise balance of energy. If we channel too much power, it could trigger a chain reaction. Kale nodded, his expression serious. Then we'll work together. I'll provide the energy, you guide it. Amara hesitated for a moment, then placed her hands over his. His skin was hot, almost searing, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she focused on the connection between them, feeling the raw power that coursed through his veins. Trust me, she said softly. Kale's molten gaze met hers, and he gave a single, solemn nod. Together, they began to work, their combined efforts bringing the ancient runes back to life. The process was intense, the air around them crackling with energy. Beads of sweat formed on Amara's brow, but she refused to falter. As the final rune flared to life, a sudden noise echoed through the chamber, a sharp, metallic clatter. Amara turned just in time to see a shadowy figure emerge from the darkness, a blade gleaming in their hand. Kale, she cried. The Firelord moved with lightning speed, intercepting the attacker with a powerful swing of his arm. The traitor staggered back, their hood falling away to reveal one of Kale's own advisors, a man with molten scars running down his face. You, Kale growled, his voice a dangerous rumble. Why betray your own people? The traitor sneered. You've grown weak, Kale. You let a human into our sacred chambers, into our very hearts. You've forgotten who you are. Kale's eyes blazed with fury, but before he could strike, the traitor lunged again. This time, Amara acted, grabbing a nearby staff and swinging it with all her might. The blow caught the traitor off guard, knocking them to the ground. Kale seized the opportunity, pinning the traitor beneath his weight. You'll answer for your crimes, he said, his voice low and dangerous. The traitor laughed, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. You think you've won? The other wards will fall. Your reign will end in fire and ash. Kale's grip tightened, but Amara placed a hand on his arm. We need him alive, she said. He knows too much. Kale hesitated, then nodded. With a swift motion, he bound the traitor's hands and dragged him to his feet. We'll take him back to the fortress, he said. There, he'll face justice. As they made their way back, the weight of their shared victory settled over them. The ward was stable, but the threat was far from over. Kale walked beside Amara, his presence a steadying force amidst the chaos. You were brave back there, he said, his voice quiet. Amara glanced up at him, her heart still racing. I couldn't have done it without you. Kale's molten gaze softened, and for a moment, the tension between them eased. Together, then, he said, we'll face whatever comes next. Together. Amara nodded, a sense of determination filling her. They had survived this battle, but the war was far from over. And as long as Kale stood by her side, she knew they had a chance. The trek back to the fortress was grueling. The captured traitor, bound and sullen, trudged ahead under the watchful eye of Kale's guards. Amara walked beside Kale, the heat of the volcanic terrain pressing down on them, but she found herself more attuned to his presence than the oppressive environment. His jaw was set, his molten eyes fixed on the horizon, but every so often his gaze flicked to her, as if silently ensuring she was unharmed. When they finally arrived, the fortress was in a state of heightened alert. The remaining wards had stabilized for now, but the tension among Kale's advisors was palpable. The traitor was swiftly escorted to the dungeons, leaving Kale and Amara alone in the war room. Kale stood by the massive obsidian table, his hands braced against its surface. The faint glow of his molten veins pulsed with the rhythm of his breaths. Amara watched him in silence, her own mind still reeling from the events of the day. They had managed to stabilize the ward, but the threat was far from over. The traitor's words echoed in her mind. The other wards will fall. You should rest, Kale said at last, his voice breaking the heavy silence. You've done more than enough for one day. Amara shook her head. There's no time for rest. We need to figure out where the next attack might happen. Kale straightened, his molten eyes meeting hers. You're relentless. I don't have the luxury of being anything else, she replied, her tone soft but resolute. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Kale stepped closer, his heat washing over her like a wave. You've risked your life for my people, he said quietly. For me. Amara's heart quickened at the intensity in his gaze. I'm not doing this just for your people, she admitted. If your realm falls, so does mine. We're in this together. Kale's expression softened, and for the first time since they met, a faint smile touched his lips. Together, he repeated, the word carrying a weight of unspoken promises. Their shared moment was interrupted by a knock at the door. One of Kale's guards entered, bowing respectfully. My lord, the traitor refuses to speak. He demands an audience with you. Kale's smile vanished, replaced by a hardened resolve. I'll deal with him, he said. Amara, wait here. She opened her mouth to protest, but Kale's look silenced her. Please, he added, his tone softer. I won't be long. Reluctantly, Amara nodded. Kale left the room, his presence lingering even after he was gone. Amara sighed, her mind racing. The traitor's actions had shaken the fragile peace she was trying to build, but she couldn't let fear cloud her judgment. They needed answers, and soon. She wandered to the balcony, the same one where she and Kale had shared their first moment of vulnerability. The volcanic plains stretched out before her, their fiery glow a stark reminder of the dangers they faced. Despite the turmoil, there was a strange beauty to this place, a raw, untamed power that mirrored Kale himself. Amara's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. She turned to see Kale returning, his expression grim. He's as defiant as ever, Kale said, joining her on the balcony. But he let something slip. There's a hidden network of tunnels beneath the eastern ridge. If he's telling the truth, that's where the next attack will come. Amara frowned. Can we trust his word? We don't have a choice, Kale replied. If there's even a chance he's right, we need to act. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared responsibility heavy between them. Then Kale reached out, his hand brushing against hers. Amara glanced up, her breath catching at the intensity in his eyes. You've been my strength in all this, Kale said softly. I've never trusted anyone as I trust you. Amara's heart swelled at his words. She placed her hand over his, their fingers intertwining. You're not alone in this, Kale. We'll face whatever comes together. Kale's molten gaze softened, and before she could think, he leaned in, his lips brushing against hers. The kiss was warm, almost searing, but Amara welcomed the heat, leaning into him as the tension of the day melted away. When they finally pulled apart, Kale rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm against her skin. You're more than I could have ever hoped for, Amara. Amara smiled, her hand lingering on his chest, feeling the steady pulse of his molten heart beneath her palm. And you're more than just a ruler to me, Kale. The moment was brief, but it strengthened their resolve. Kale straightened, his expression once again serious. We leave at dawn. Get some rest. We'll need all our strength for what's to come. Amara nodded, though she knew sleep would not come easily. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Together, they would face whatever dangers lay ahead. Together, they would protect their people. And together, they would endure. The morning sky over the volcanic plains was a deep, ominous red as Kale and Amara led a small group of warriors toward the eastern ridge. The weight of the mission settled heavily on Amara's shoulders. If the trader's information was accurate, the hidden network of tunnels beneath the ridge posed a significant threat. But if it was a trap, they were walking directly into danger. Kale walked beside her, his towering frame a reassuring presence. His molten eyes were sharp, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. Despite the gravity of their mission, his occasional glances toward Amara carried a warmth that steadied her nerves. The connection they'd forged in the crucible of their trials felt unbreakable. As they approached the ridge, the terrain grew more treacherous. Jagged rocks jutted from the ground, and the air grew hotter, the heat radiating up from deep fissures in the earth. Kale raised a hand, signaling the group to halt. "The entrance should be just ahead," he said, his voice low. "Stay alert." Amara nodded, gripping the hilt of the short blade Kale had given her. She wasn't a warrior, but she was determined to stand by his side, no matter the cost. Kale led the way to a narrow crevice hidden between two large boulders. The faint glow of molten rock illuminated the entrance to a tunnel. Kale turned to his warriors. "Two of you will stay here to guard the entrance. The rest follow me." They descended into the tunnel, the oppressive heat intensifying with each step. The walls were slick with condensation, the air thick and stifling. Amara stayed close to Kale, her eyes darting between the shadows that seemed to shift and writhe around them. The tunnel opened into a large cavern, its ceiling disappearing into darkness. In the center of the chamber, a series of ancient mechanisms stood, their surfaces etched with glowing runes. Amara's breath caught. These were similar to the ward she'd seen before, but older, more intricate. Kale's expression darkened. "These devices are connected to the Eastern Ward. If they're destroyed," he didn't need to finish. Amara stepped forward, her mind racing as she studied the mechanisms. "They're fragile," she said. "One wrong move could destabilize the entire system." Kale placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch grounding her. "Can you reinforce them?" Amara nodded. "I think so, but I'll need your help to channel the energy." Kale's molten eyes softened, a flicker of admiration in his gaze. "Then we'll do it together." They moved quickly, Amara guiding Kale as he placed his hands over the runes. The air around them crackled with energy as Kale channeled his power, the ancient mechanisms glowing brighter under their combined efforts. Amara's hands trembled as she worked, but Kale's steady presence kept her focused. Just as the final mechanism stabilized, a sharp noise echoed through the cavern, a metallic clang, followed by hurried footsteps. Amara spun around as figures emerged from the shadows, weapons gleaming in the dim light. "Ambush!" Kale roared, drawing his massive blade. The cavern erupted into chaos. Kale's warriors clashed with the attackers, their weapons ringing out in a deadly symphony. Amara pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding. She could see Kale in the thick of the battle, his movements fluid and powerful as he cut through their enemies. One of the attackers broke away from the fight, rushing toward her with a dagger raised. Amara's instincts kicked in, and she dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding the blade. She raised her own weapon, her hands shaking, and parried the next strike. The force of the impact jarred her, but she held her ground. Before the attacker could strike again, Kale was there. With a single, powerful swing, he disarmed the assailant and knocked them to the ground. His molten eyes blazed with fury as he stood protectively in front of Amara. "Stay behind me," he commanded, his voice a deep growl. Amara nodded, her pulse racing. She watched as Kale fought with a ferocity she had never seen before, his blade cutting through the air with deadly precision. The attackers began to fall back, their numbers dwindling under the relentless assault. Finally, the last of the assailants retreated into the shadows, disappearing into the depths of the tunnel. The cavern fell silent once more, the only sound the crackling of molten rock. Kale lowered his blade, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. He turned to Amara, his molten eyes filled with concern. Are you hurt? Amara shook her head, her hands still trembling. I'm fine, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thanks to you. Kale stepped closer, his intense gaze never leaving hers. You were brave, he said softly. Braver than I could have asked for. Amara felt her cheeks flush under his praise. She looked up at him, her breath hitching as she realized just how close they were. His molten eyes burned with a heat that had nothing to do with the volcanic chamber around them. Before she could stop herself, she reached up, her fingers brushing against his cheek. Kale closed his eyes at her touch, his body relaxing under her gentle caress. When he opened them again, there was a tenderness in his gaze that made her heart ache. Amara, he murmured, his voice low and filled with unspoken emotion. She didn't need words to understand what he was feeling, because she felt it too. Without hesitation, she leaned in, her lips meeting his in a searing kiss. The heat between them was overwhelming, but Amara welcomed it, losing herself in the moment. When they finally pulled apart, Kale rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm against her skin. You mean more to me than I can put into words, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Amara smiled, her fingers still tracing the lines of his molten veins. And you mean more to me than I ever expected, she said softly. Their moment was interrupted by one of Kale's warriors, who approached with a grim expression. My lord, the attackers have retreated, but we found evidence that they've been here for weeks. They've likely sabotaged more than just the Eastern Ward. Kale's expression hardened, the warmth in his eyes replaced by determination. Then we have no time to waste. We'll secure the other wards before it's too late. Amara nodded, her resolve renewed. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. Together, they would face whatever dangers lay ahead. Together, they would fight for the future of both their peoples. The fortress was quiet in the hours after their return, a fragile calm settling over its blackened halls. The battle in the tunnels had been a victory, but no one dared to celebrate. The looming threat of sabotage to the remaining wards kept tensions high, and every flicker of molten light seemed to cast shadows that whispered of betrayal. Amara sat in a private chamber, her hands wrapped around a warm, earthen cup of herbal brew meant to calm her nerves. Despite her exhaustion, her thoughts raced. The traitor's words about the other wards echoed in her mind, a chilling reminder of how much still hung in the balance. She glanced toward the open doorway, half expecting Kale to appear, his towering frame bringing both reassurance and a reminder of the gravity of their mission. As if summoned by her thoughts, Kale entered, his presence commanding as always. His molten eyes softened when they met hers, and for a moment, the weight of his responsibilities seemed to lift. You should be resting, Kale said, his voice low but firm as he crossed the room. Amara managed a small smile. I could say the same to you. Kale sat beside her, the heat radiating from his body a comforting contrast to the cold tension in the air. He rested his forearms on his knees, his hands clasped together as he stared into the flickering flames of the hearth. The enemy is relentless, he said after a moment. They've been working in the shadows for too long, and I fear we're only beginning to see the extent of their reach. Amara reached out, placing a hand on his arm. His molten veins pulsed faintly beneath her touch, a steady rhythm that mirrored his heartbeat. We'll stop them, she said firmly. Together, we've already accomplished so much. We'll protect the remaining wards. Kale turned his head, his molten eyes locking onto hers. I've never doubted your courage, Amara, he said, his voice a quiet rumble. But this battle isn't just against a visible enemy. The more we fight, the more I feel my control slipping. Amara frowned. What do you mean? Kale exhaled slowly, the flames in the hearth flickering in response. My power is tied to the volcano's core. Every surge of emotion, every battle, it feeds the fire within me. If I lose control, even for a moment, I could unleash destruction greater than any enemy could hope to achieve. Amara's hand tightened on his arm. You won't lose control, she said, her voice steady. I've seen your strength, Kale. You've carried this burden for so long, and you're still standing. Kale's gaze softened, his lips curving into a faint, almost reluctant smile. You make me believe it's possible. Amara leaned closer, her other hand coming to rest against his cheek. His skin was warm, the molten glow beneath it illuminating the lines of his strong features. It is possible, she whispered. You're not alone in this. Kale closed his eyes for a moment, leaning into her touch. When he opened them again, the vulnerability in his molten gaze was clear. You've become my anchor, Amara, he admitted. Without you, I fear I would have already fallen. Amara's heart swelled at his words. She tilted her head, her lips brushing against his in a tender kiss. Kale responded immediately, his hand rising to cup the back of her neck, pulling her closer. The kiss deepened, their connection burning as fiercely as the flames surrounding them. When they finally pulled apart, Kale rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm against her skin. You ground me, he murmured, in ways I never thought possible. Amara smiled, her fingers tracing the molten lines of his jaw. And you give me strength, she replied. We balance each other. Kale sighed, his eyes flickering with renewed determination. Then I'll hold on to that balance, he said. For as long as I can. Their moment of quiet intimacy was interrupted by a knock at the door. One of Kale's trusted guards entered, his expression grim. My lord, we've received word from the Northern Ward. There's been movement, unusual activity near the boundary. Kale's demeanor shifted instantly, the warmth in his eyes replaced by the cold precision of a leader preparing for battle. He rose to his full height, his presence commanding. Alert the warriors. We leave immediately. The guard bowed and departed swiftly. Kale turned back to Amara, his molten gaze filled with unspoken concern. Stay here, he said. It's too dangerous. Amara stood, her chin lifting defiantly. I'm coming with you. Kale hesitated, but the determination in her eyes left no room for argument. You never back down, he said, a hint of admiration in his voice. Not when it matters, Amara replied. Kale nodded, his respect for her unwavering. Then we face this together. The journey to the Northern Ward was tense, the air thick with anticipation. The landscape grew more treacherous, the ground beneath them cracked and uneven, as if the very earth was holding its breath. Kale led the way, his molten eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. When they arrived, the ward was eerily quiet. The massive stone structure stood tall, its runes glowing faintly in the dim light. But the stillness was deceptive. Kale raised a hand, signaling for the group to halt. Something's wrong, he murmured. As if on cue, a low rumble echoed through the ground. Kale's warriors drew their weapons, their eyes narrowing as shadows began to shift around the ward. From the darkness, figures emerged, their forms cloaked and weapons drawn. Kale stepped forward, his blade gleaming in the molten light. You've made a grave mistake, he said, his voice a dangerous growl. The leader of the attackers stepped forward, a smirk visible beneath their hood. The mistake is yours, Firelord, they sneered. You cannot protect what is already crumbling. The battle erupted in an instant. Kale charged forward, his blade clashing against the enemies with a force that shook the ground. Amara stayed close to him, her blade at the ready as she defended herself against the attackers that broke through the line. Despite their fierce resistance, the enemies seemed determined to bring down the ward. Kale fought with unmatched ferocity, his molten power surging as he defended his realm. But Amara could see the strain in his movements, the way his control wavered with each surge of energy. Amara's focus sharpened as she fought beside him, her resolve unshaken. They would not let the enemy win. Together, they would protect the ward and their future. The battlefield around the Northern Ward was chaos. The air was thick with the clash of metal and the shouts of warriors, punctuated by the occasional rumble of the unstable ground beneath them. The ward itself pulsed with a faint glow, its runes flickering as if struggling to maintain their power. Kale moved like a force of nature, his blade cutting through the enemy with precise, powerful strikes. His molten veins glowed brighter with each swing, the heat radiating from his body intensifying. Amara stayed close, her blade a blur as she parried and struck, each movement fueled by the determination to protect what they had fought so hard to preserve. Despite their efforts, the enemy pressed on. Their leader, a cloaked figure with a commanding presence, barked orders from the shadows, directing the assault toward the ward's vulnerable points. Amara's eyes narrowed as she caught sight of the leader's movements. They were clearly aiming to destabilize the ward completely. Kale, she called, her voice cutting through the din. They're targeting the core mechanisms. Kale's gaze followed her line of sight, his molten eyes narrowing. Stay with me, he said, his voice low but firm. Together, they pushed toward the ward, cutting through the attackers who blocked their path. The heat around them grew oppressive, the very air shimmering as Kale's power surged. Amara could feel the strain in him, the delicate balance he maintained between control and destruction. As they reached the base of the ward, the enemy leader stepped forward, drawing a long, wicked blade. Their hood fell back, revealing a face marked by molten scars, their eyes burning with fanatical zeal. Firelord, the leader spat, their voice filled with venom. Your reign ends here. Kale didn't respond with words. He raised his blade, his molten eyes blazing with determination, and charged. The two clashed in a furious exchange of blows, the ground beneath them trembling with the force of their battle. Amara watched, her heart pounding. She could see the toll the fight was taking on Kale, his movements growing heavier with each strike. The leader was fast, their blade moving with deadly precision, but Kale's raw power was unmatched. As the battle raged on, Amar's attention was drawn to the ward's core. The runes were dimming further, their glow flickering dangerously. If they failed completely, the volcanic energy they contained would be unleashed, devastating the entire region. Without hesitation, Amara sprinted toward the core, her mind racing. She had studied the ward mechanisms before. If she could stabilize them, they might have a chance. Her hands moved quickly, tracing the runes and murmuring the ancient words she had learned. The core responded, its glow steadying slightly, but the strain was evident. Amara could feel the heat seeping into her skin, the energy pulsing through her like a living force. She gritted her teeth, focusing all her energy on the task at hand. Behind her, Kale and the enemy leader continued their brutal fight. The clang of their blades echoed through the cavern, each strike sending shockwaves through the ground. Kale's molten veins pulsed brighter, the heat around him intensifying as he pushed himself to his limits. Amara, Kale's voice rang out, filled with both warning and concern. She turned just in time to see one of the enemy warriors breaking through the line, their blade aimed directly at her. Amara's heart leapt, but before she could react, Kale was there. He intercepted the attacker with a powerful strike, his blade cutting through them with ease. The effort cost him, though. Kale staggered, his breaths coming in heavy gasps. His molten veins pulsed erratically, the heat around him spiking dangerously. Kale, Amara cried, rushing to his side. He steadied himself, his molten eyes meeting hers. I'm fine, he said, though his voice was strained. Focus on the ward. Amara nodded, her resolve strengthening. She returned to the core, her hands moving with renewed urgency. The runes flared to life under her touch, their glow stabilizing further. She could feel the energy aligning, the delicate balance slowly being restored. But the battle wasn't over. The enemy leader, seeing their forces faltering, let out a furious cry. They raised their blade, the molten scars on their face glowing brighter as they charged toward Kale. Kale met the charge head-on, his blade clashing against the leaders with a deafening roar. The ground beneath them cracked, molten energy surging around their feet. It was a battle of sheer will, neither willing to back down. Amara worked frantically, her focus split between the ward and the battle unfolding before her. She could see Kale's strength waning, his movements slowing under the strain. The leader pressed their advantage, their strikes growing more ferocious. Kale, hold on, Amara shouted, her voice filled with desperation. Kale gritted his teeth, his molten eyes blazing with defiance. With a final surge of power, he deflected the leader's blade and drove his own weapon forward. The leader's eyes widened in shock as Kale's blade pierced through their chest, the molten energy surging through them in a blinding flash. The leader collapsed, their body crumbling to ash as the volcanic energy consumed them. Kale stood over them, his chest heaving, the heat around him finally beginning to subside. Amara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She turned her attention back to the ward, her hands moving with precision as she completed the stabilization. The runes flared to life, their glow steady and strong. "It's done," she said, her voice shaking with relief. "The ward is stable." Kale approached, his molten eyes softening as he looked at her. "You saved us," he said, his voice filled with quiet admiration. Amara smiled, her exhaustion evident, but her resolve unbroken. "We saved each other." Kale reached out, his hand resting gently on her cheek. His touch was warm, grounding her in the moment. "I couldn't have done this without you," he murmured. Amara leaned into his touch, her heart swelling with both relief and affection. "And I couldn't have done it without you." They stood together in the glow of the ward, their connection stronger than ever. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together, they would protect their people and their future. The return to the fortress was heavy with the weight of both victory and looming uncertainty. The northern ward had been stabilized, the enemy leader vanquished, but Kale and Amara both knew this was only a temporary reprieve. The enemy's sabotage had pushed the volcanic system to its limits. If one more ward fell, it could spell the end for Kale's realm and beyond. Kale's warriors tended to their wounded as the fortress bustled with activity. Fires burned in the great hall, their flickering light casting long shadows on the obsidian walls. Amara stood near the hearth, her arms wrapped around herself as she replayed the events of the battle in her mind. Every move, every strike, every desperate attempt to hold the line, it was all too vivid. Kale entered the room, his presence immediately commanding attention. His molten eyes softened when they landed on Amara, and he crossed the space to stand beside her. He didn't speak at first, simply resting a hand on her shoulder. His touch was warm, grounding her. "You did well today," he said finally, his voice low and steady. Amara turned to him, her expression serious. "We may have won this battle, but the war isn't over. The wards are holding for now, but for how long?" Kale's jaw tightened. "Not long enough," he admitted. "The energy within the volcano is restless. Even with the ward stabilized, it's only a matter of time before it reaches a breaking point." Amara frowned, her mind racing. "There must be something we can do to strengthen the wards, some way to buy us more time." Kale hesitated, his molten eyes flickering with a mix of determination and reluctance. "There's a way," he said slowly, "but it's dangerous. It requires a direct connection to the volcano's core, a ritual that could either stabilize the energy or destroy us in the process." Amara's heart skipped a beat. "Why didn't you mention this before?" "Because it's a last resort," Kale said, his voice heavy. "The ritual requires immense power and absolute control. If I lose focus for even a moment," he trailed off, the unspoken consequences clear in his expression. Amara placed a hand on his chest, feeling the steady pulse of his molten heart beneath her palm. "You won't lose control," she said firmly. "We've faced every challenge together so far. We can do this." Kale searched her eyes, his own gaze filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. "If we do this," he said, "there's no turning back." Amara nodded. "Then we'll face it together." Kale exhaled slowly, his tension easing slightly under her unwavering confidence. "The ritual must be performed at the heart of the volcano," he said. "It's a place where the energy of the land is at its most potent." Amara's brow furrowed. "And what will I need to do?" Kale took her hands in his, the heat of his touch sending a shiver through her. "You'll be my anchor," he said. "The ritual will channel the volcano's energy through me, but I'll need your strength to keep my focus. Without you, I won't be able to contain it." Amara swallowed hard, the gravity of his words sinking in. Then you'll have my strength, she said. Every last bit of it. Kale's gaze softened, and he leaned down, pressing a tender kiss to her forehead. You've already given me more than I deserve, he murmured. The next morning, they prepared for the journey to the heart of the volcano. The path was treacherous, winding through molten rivers and jagged cliffs. Kale's warriors offered to accompany them, but he declined. This was something only he and Amara could face together. As they reached the entrance to the heart, the air grew thick with heat and the sound of the volcano's rumbling pulse. The chamber was vast, its walls glowing with molten veins that crisscrossed like the lifeblood of the land. In the center, a massive pool of molten lava churned, its surface shifting with raw, untamed power. Kale stepped forward, his molten veins pulsing brighter as he approached the pool. He turned to Amara, his expression grave but resolute. Once we begin, there's no stopping until the ritual is complete. Amara nodded, her heart pounding. I'm ready. Kale extended his hand, and she took it without hesitation. Together, they stepped to the edge of the pool. Kale raised his free hand, murmuring ancient words in a language that seemed to resonate with the very core of the volcano. The molten pool responded, its surface glowing brighter as the energy within it began to rise. Amara felt the surge of power immediately. It was overwhelming, a tidal wave of heat and energy that threatened to consume her. But Kale's grip on her hand was firm, his presence grounding her as the ritual continued. The energy flowed through Kale, his molten veins glowing like molten rivers beneath his skin. His body trembled under the strain, but his focus remained unbroken. Amara closed her eyes, concentrating on her connection to him. She poured every ounce of her strength into him, her will intertwining with his as they worked together to channel the volatile energy. The molten pool roared, its surface rising as the energy reached its peak. Kale let out a strained growl, his grip on Amara tightening. She could feel his struggle, the immense power threatening to tear him apart. You can do this, Kale, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. I'm with you. Kale's molten eyes met hers, and for a moment, the storm within him seemed to calm. He drew on her strength, his focus sharpening as he continued the ritual. The energy within the pool began to stabilize, its wild surges slowing to a steady rhythm. Minutes felt like hours as they maintained the delicate balance. Finally, the molten pool began to recede, its surface calming as the energy within it was contained. Kale's body relaxed, his molten veins dimming slightly as the ritual came to an end. Amara let out a shaky breath, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. Kale caught her, pulling her into his arms. His body was still warm, his heart beating steadily against her. It's done, he said, his voice filled with both relief and exhaustion. The wards are strengthened. Amara smiled, her head resting against his chest. We did it. Kale held her close, his molten eyes filled with gratitude and affection. I couldn't have done it without you, he murmured. Together, they stood at the heart of the volcano, their bond stronger than ever. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, they had hope, a hope forged in fire and tempered by their unbreakable connection. The ritual had left both Kale and Amara drained, but there was no time to linger at the heart of the volcano. The wards had been reinforced, and for now, the volcano's energy was stable. Yet the threat of future attacks still loomed. They began their descent back to the fortress, their steps heavy, but their resolve unshaken. The path was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant hum of molten rivers. Amara glanced at Kale as they walked. His molten veins had dimmed slightly, his body still recovering from the immense strain of the ritual. Yet his presence remained as strong and steadfast as ever. You did it, she said softly, breaking the silence. The wards are stronger because of you. Kale gave a slight shake of his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Because of us, he corrected. His molten eyes met hers, their warmth filling her with a sense of peace despite the danger they still faced. You were my anchor, Amara. I couldn't have done it alone. The weight of his words settled over her, and she reached out, intertwining her fingers with his. The simple gesture spoke volumes, a silent acknowledgement of their shared strength and the bond that had grown between them. When they finally reached the fortress, they were met with a mixture of relief and concern. Kale's warriors and advisors gathered in the great hall, their expressions a blend of hope and weariness. The fortress buzzed with the energy of preparation. Despite the ritual's success, they knew the fight was far from over. Kale addressed his people, his voice steady and commanding. The wards are stable, but the enemy will not stop. They know our strength now, and they will seek new ways to break us. We must remain vigilant. The crowd nodded, their determination evident. Kale's leadership had always inspired loyalty, but now, with Amara at his side, the resolve of his people seemed stronger than ever. As the meeting dispersed, Kale and Amara retreated to a quieter chamber. The weight of the day pressed down on them, and for a moment, neither spoke. Kale sat by the hearth, the glow of the fire reflecting in his molten eyes. Amara joined him, the silence between them comfortable and familiar. "You've given my people hope," Kale said after a while, his voice low. "Hope that we can endure, that we can build a future beyond this war." Amara rested her hand on his, her touch gentle yet firm. "We'll do more than endure," she said. "We'll rebuild together." Kale's gaze softened, and he reached up to gently cup her cheek. His thumb traced a light, comforting path along her skin, sending a warm shiver down her spine. "You've changed everything," he murmured. "Not just for my people, but for me." Amara's breath caught at the intensity of his words. She leaned into his touch, her heart pounding. "You've changed me too," she admitted. "I never thought I'd find someone I could trust like this." Kale's molten eyes flickered with emotion, and he leaned in, capturing her lips in a tender, lingering kiss. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them, their connection unshakable. When they pulled apart, Kale rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm against her skin. "I will protect you always," he vowed, his voice a quiet promise. "And I'll stand by you," Amara replied, "no matter what comes." Their moment of peace was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. One of Kale's advisors entered, their expression urgent. "My lord, there's been movement at the southern border. Scouts report unusual activity near the outer villages." Kale's expression hardened, and he rose to his full height, his commanding presence filling the room. "Assemble the warriors," he said. "We'll meet this threat head on." Amara stood as well, her resolve unshaken. "I'm coming with you." Kale hesitated for a moment, his molten eyes filled with concern. "Amara." "No arguments," she said firmly. "We've faced everything together so far. This will be no different." Kale's lips pressed into a thin line, but he nodded, his respect for her unwavering. "Very well," he said, "but stay close to me." The southern border was a day's journey from the fortress, and the group moved swiftly, their movements precise and calculated. Amara could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the impending battle. But she also felt the strength of the warriors around her, their loyalty to Kale unwavering. When they reached the outer villages, the enemy's presence was clear. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, and the ground was littered with signs of a recent skirmish. Kale's molten eyes burned with anger as he surveyed the scene. "They're testing our defenses," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "They want to see how far we'll go to protect what's ours." Amara placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "Then let's show them." The battle that followed was fierce and unrelenting. Kale led his warriors with unmatched ferocity, his molten blade cutting through the enemy like a force of nature. Amara fought beside him, her movements swift and calculated. Despite the chaos, they moved as one, their connection unbreakable. The enemy was relentless, but Kale's warriors fought with a strength and determination that could not be matched. Slowly but surely, they began to push the enemy back, reclaiming the ground that had been lost. As the battle reached its climax, Kale faced off against a powerful enemy commander. Their clash was brutal, the ground shaking beneath them with each strike. But Kale's strength and resolve proved too much, and with a final, devastating blow, he brought the commander down. The enemy forces faltered, their morale shattered. Kale's warriors pressed the advantage, driving them back until the battlefield was theirs once more. When the dust settled, Kale stood tall, his molten veins pulsing with the remnants of his power. Amara approached, her eyes filled with both relief and admiration. "We did it," she said, her voice filled with quiet triumph. Kale nodded, his gaze softening as he looked at her. Together. As they stood on the battlefield, the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, casting a warm glow over the land. It was a new day, a new beginning. And though the road ahead would be difficult, Kale and Amara knew they would face it together, their bond unbreakable, their future forged in fire.